Because my experience with intellect has been quite a long time. I think it's about 5 years that I've been working with you, and in a variety of different areas. So, whilst today I'm going to be talking about my experience mainly as journal editor, I have in the past and at the present and in the future had a variety of experiences with intellect. I came to intellect with the proposal for a journal, Studies in Russian and Soviet Cinema, because my background is in Russian cultural studies. I specialize in Russian theatre and cinema, and whilst I have previously worked quite extensively on theatre performance and plays, I had by the late 1990s moved quite significantly into Russian and Soviet film studies. And I had previously been working on journals to do with Russian studies. I had been a section editor of the Modern Language Review, which is a publication by the Modern Humanities Research Association. So from that perspective, I had quite a good editorial experience in terms of journal publishing. But at the same time, I had also launched an online journal on Russian cinema, which I'll come back to in a moment. And taking those experiences together, I thought it would be quite a good idea to have a journal that would be devoted to the history of Russian and Soviet cinema. So when I had this idea about a journal, I came to Intellect on the recommendation actually of Susan Hayward, and that's another reference that I can bring in apart from having listened to her performance on the Intellect website. And I was met here with extreme enthusiasm. It was kind of, you come to a publisher with a proposal for a journal where you think, okay, this is probably a rather niche journal. It is not only Russian and Soviet, but it's also film studies, so it's kind of, it's not going to be your blockbuster or bestseller. And I was basically kind of, preparing good arguments for why it might be worth doing that journal. I was walking through open doors. And I have found that extremely positive as an experience, that you didn't have to argue for the case of a journal in film studies, media studies, creative arts, but that you could actually focus on more important issues than opening the door, as it were. So that was an extremely positive experience. And I had a similar experience when I tried to place a book which I had co-written with a colleague from the United States on contemporary Russian theatre. And it was a book it's called Performing Violence, Literary and Theatrical Experience of New Russian Drama. It was a book devoted to a phenomenon that was quite recent, that was also quite niche, but very important for the development of Russian culture in general, which we have seen since has had a massive impact on filmmaking and other creative arts in the contemporary Russian scene. And my experience with the book publication side has been equally positive. There is a lot of kind of support. There is professional support, and what I found particularly fascinating is the visual support and the designs that were done both for the journals, and I'll come back to that in a moment, for the journals but also for the book publications, where always there was a consultation process of which images might be suitable for the cover. And it's quite important for me, because I think when you look at a journal, when you look at a book, the first thing you see is the face, i.e. the cover. And finally, I was then approached when Intellect launched the Directory of World Cinemas, whether I would edit the journal, the issue on Russia. And with the background that I've just already explained, I had no problems. I knew that I would have excellent, again, editorial support from the team here at Intellect. And I think this is a hugely important, valuable project. I think that all students will go back to these publications in terms of references for the films for a short analysis of the films, but also for the synopses of the films, because students have a tendency, and indeed we have a tendency also, to forget what was exactly the plot of that film, which we might have seen 10, 15, 20 years ago. So from that perspective, I think you should understand what is going to come next. So I have then been a journal editor with Intellect for 4 years now. That is a year preparation, because we actually started talking about the journal quite a bit ahead of its launch, as one would expect. And the experience here at Intellect is again one of you're kind of never left alone with any questions, with any doubts that you might have, which I have found extremely valuable. Whether that is a question of, do you think I can actually get away with not peer reviewing a short survey article? Do you think it would be possible to do something special, to do a special feature? Whatever issue comes up, I have always found the communication process and the consultation process with Intellect an extremely positive and supportive one. And not in the sense that they would always say, yes, do that, but to actually discuss what the advantages and disadvantages might be. And I think this has always been extremely helpful. So on the journal front, I work with one person here at Intellect, and that is Sarah Cunningham, who is currently looking after my journal from the inception to scheduling, to dealing with the copy editor, through the typesetting process, the proofs and corrections, and also issues relating to the journal being affiliated to a professional organization, which we have recently managed to do. There is a major subject organization in the United States, and Sarah has negotiated with that association the journal's affiliation, which is good for promoting the journal, but it's also nice to have some additional organizational support when you go around and try to, what I come to later, to shop for articles. But also special event marketing, although this is done in conjunction, of course, with the marketing department, and that is James here at Intellect. As a journal editor, I think what is very, very important for all of us to bear in mind is that the more information you can give the publisher, the better, in form of conferences, in form of other events where there might be a marketing opportunity. And this is not so much for Intellect, in inverted commas, to make more money, but it is for the journals to be promoted to a wider range of people. And that, in turn, will not only help your subscription rates, but it will also help the standing of your journal, the reputation of your journal, and the awareness of people that this journal is around, that this is a reputable journal, and you will get more submissions. So you're actually helping yourself. I would like to briefly talk about my journal, which is a film journal, as I've already explained, and how it came about. I've already given you my background of work with the Modern Language Review, and I'd like to go back to the journal that I founded in 2003 as a quarterly online journal on contemporary Russian cinema, which is called Kinokultura. And whilst Kinokultura, as I said, is an online, non-peer-reviewed journal, which is devoted only to contemporary Russian cinema and has the remit of, as it were, doing a little bit of propaganda for Russian cinema. I think Russian cinema was in particular need of support in the late 1990s and early years of the new millennium. And Kinokultura publishes mainly film reviews, but also survey articles, festival reports, and other visual arts projects which lend themselves particularly for a presentation, for a publication online rather than in print. And whilst Kinokultura expanded rapidly, it also became clear that it is quite limited in its scope because we did not want to dilute, as it were, the remit of focusing on contemporary Russian cinema, but there were quite a number of articles, and we have in fact one article in the very, very early issues of Kinokultura, which were devoted to the history of Russian Soviet cinema. And it became clear that there was an opportunity here and a niche here, because all our specialist journals in Russian studies, Soviet studies, focused mainly on the economical, political, historical side, partly on literature and a little bit on culture. So you had very few opportunities, very few openings in these journals for pieces on not only cultural studies but certainly on film studies. And we thought at the time that this would be an ideal opportunity, having already built up a network of people who were writing reviews for us, who were reading the journal, to actually now go and launch a journal on the history of cinema, of Russian Soviet cinema. And one of the things that we had also done in Kinokultura was to have special issues on the cinematographies of the different countries that had gained independence in the early 1990s. And this has been one of our hobby horses, as it were, because we were the first journal. Kinokultura was the first journal to actually have a special issue on Slovak cinema. Nobody had ever thought about actually disentangling the histories of Czech and Slovak cinema. So we were kind of this was a special issue where the guest editor kind of attempted to rewrite cinematographic history for that part of the world, which was kind of quite fun. So we then, having established that it was a good idea to have a journal devoted to Russian Soviet cinema and to its history, a journal that would be peer-reviewed, and having had such a very warm reception here at Intellect and such huge support, we launched the journal. One of the things that I think I remember we discussed quite at length was the title of the journal. You may not have that problem. We always have a problem with the journal title when dealing with that part of the world, as it were, when dealing with a country that no longer exists, but that is still used very widely to label a geographical area. So you couldn't call it post-Soviet because that would have limited us in time, because the term post-Soviet is not only a geographical one, but it's also a temporal one. So we couldn't really leave out the word Soviet because that would have excluded 70 years of Soviet filmmaking. We didn't want to call it pre-Soviet, Soviet, and post-Soviet. So we had a bit of a dilemma here. We could have called it the cinematographies of the Commonwealth of Independent States, and I'm sure that we would have stepped on somebody's toe there. So we're kind of, having tossed it around, I was telling myself, I said, do you think it would be completely politically incorrect to have Soviet in the title? Unfortunately, he said he didn't think there was a problem with that, so we're called Studies in Russian Soviet Cinema. In short, SRSC. When we launched, Intellect had a lovely design, and you actually suggested various designs for the journal cover, and they were all these kind of very fluid, futuristic color developments. And you could pick. I think I had one proposal which was sort of violet and yellow, and another one which was all different colors. We ended up with something that had the color red in it, and I think I don't need to explain why that is the case. as it turned out, red is now the marker for all the film journals in Intellect, so I think we kind of made the right choice here. At the beginning of this year, Intellect changed the layouts, the cover designs for the journals, and reverted to images. And we've kind of been looking at the various postcards here, and I think this is a wonderful idea because it is a much more memorable impression that you get. So when you are in the process of choosing your cover designs, do think about what message you want to send through the cover. I think we were looking at the designs, for example, for Eastern European cinema and also Chinese cinema, which I think are kind of, they are stunning in that they immediately tell you a story. Whether that is the story that the journal is about is a different matter, but they tell you something. And I hope that we've kind of captured something here as well by choosing an image with rather dark clouds behind of a statue, a monument that is called the Monument to the Worker and the Peasant, holding hammer and sickle, which was designed for the World Exhibition in Paris in the 1930s. It was the monument that stood at the opening of the Soviet pavilion to that exhibition, and it has a connection with cinema in that it is used as the logo for Mosfilm, the largest film studio in the country. And as a sort of footnote addition, there have been talks, although I'm not convinced that this is going to happen. The whole thing has been dismantled recently and rebuilt. I think they've polished all the bits and pieces, and they have built a new pedestal, a new kind of basis, which is 3 times larger than the previous one. And legend had it at one point that the Museum of Cinema was going to be housed underneath, which would have been exciting, but I don't think it's going to happen. Somehow, I think they're going to find kind of some shopping mall that will kind of pay much more. Now, let us look at what we have done in terms of editors, co-editors, and editorial boards. SRSC has one editor, you know that, has 3 co-editors. 2 co-editors from the UK, 1 from the US. I think it's a very, very good idea to spread the geographical locations of your co-editors, because it will help you both in attracting submissions but also in liaising with libraries, library reps, in order to get subscriptions going. In my case, my US editor has been liaising quite intensively with libraries and lobbying libraries to subscribe, but what is more important, also been assisting in making sure that the indexing of the journal was done immediately after its launch, and that has been extremely helpful, because this is the same person who also looks after the MLA and ATSI's indexing for Kinokultura, so we were aware how important that is. The UK editors help more with the planning of content, and my 2 UK editors are both experts in their field. One is retired and the other is in post. And I also have a book editor, currently located in the US, who deals with book reviews. And I think my recommendation when you look for book editors is make sure that you find somebody who's good at communicating, who has initiative, who will contact publishers, because one of the things that will not happen is that you launch your journal and you will just get this flow of books coming in for review. You need somebody who will go to exhibitions at conferences, to book exhibits at conferences, give them a card. I usually give them my business card, which Intellect beautifully provides you with. You get postcards and business card. Give them a postcard of the journal or your business card and say, we are a new journal, we would like to review books in that particular area, could you please make sure you send us a review copy? And it will only be sort of 3-4 years after you've launched the journal that you will get a flow of books actually coming to your journal for review. So do make sure that you do that, or that your book editor goes to these exhibits and gets in contact with publishers. My current book editor is absolutely fabulous. I don't even need to ask whether she's got a book or whether she's placed the book for review. That's the sort of, the dream scenario where you can just completely rely on somebody to make sure that they get all the relevant publications. In fact, at one point I was talking to her and she said, and I've got this book for publication and for review, and who do you think might be a good reviewer? That's the sort of thing we occasionally do talk about. And it was a publication, I think she had it was one of those dissertation publications where you actually have to request a print to be done for you in order to give the book to somebody to review, and she'd organised that. Incredible. So then you have an editorial and an advisory board, and forgive me for putting it in these broad, very socialist terms, but when I first tried to figure out what might be editorial and what might be advisory, I couldn't quite see the difference. And I sort of labelled them for myself the proletariat, or the workhorses, and the aristocracy, i.e. those people who lend you their name, and who thereby boost the reputation of the journal enormously, but who don't necessarily participate in the day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month running of the journal. On the editorial board, I would strongly advise you to make sure that you have representatives from various countries. And of course from various universities, to help build a wide reach of the journal. I have also made a point of including people from different disciplines. And I know this is not going to be applicable to all of the journals that you will be running, but just to give you an example, in my case, not just focusing on film studies and area studies, but also going into cultural studies, into comparative literature, wherever there is somebody with an interest in that subject. In fact, history of art, I think, is in many cases also an area where, certainly for film studies, one might look into. I happen to have a colleague who is labelled, or who labels himself an art historian, who's just published a book on Eisenstein. So, everything is possible. On the advisory board, I think what is important is that you want to make the journal attractive, that you have those people who have really published an enormous amount. I don't know how you're going to do this in animation study. I think you have to put yourself on all the boards and as editor. But make it attractive for contributors. Your contributors are going to look, who's on the boards, whose names do I recognize? The more names they recognize, the better. They are purely decorative, at least in my case. My advisory board is purely decorative. I write to them once a year and I say thank you very much for having lent the name. And I think one thing I would also add is it's very important, even though you're not going to work your lords and ladies, do keep in touch with them, because otherwise they feel like kind of useless accessories. They're very sensitive. So the editorial board you're going to be in touch with anyway, because what I normally do is, and I'll come to the peer review process in a moment, but what I normally do is I involve, if I can at all, one person from the editorial board in the peer review process of every article, and one person from outside the editorial board. It doesn't always work, and don't worry if it doesn't. Don't worry if you have two people from the editorial board reviewing the same article. I tend to try and do that. If it doesn't work, don't break your back and don't bend over backwards to try and do something that makes no sense in terms of content. One thing that I have also invented for myself is, and I'll tell you in a moment why, I have special sections in each of the 3 issues. My journal comes out 3 times a year, and I have a special feature for each of the issues, and I keep them quite distinct and separate for every volume, in that the first issue always includes a section of sorry, I've kind of got them completely in the wrong order here. The first, it's an intellectual exercise. I mean, you need to be able to sort of not just read from top to bottom, but you need to jump across the screen. The first issue always contains a screenplay of a new film or a text that has not been published before in the original language or in translation. So I have published, 3-4 screenplays now. I try to choose a film that has created some kind of discussion, conflict, challenge, that has won an award, a recent film. In the first issue, we had a script of a film that was made in the late 1980s, but it was a kind of a stunning coincidence. The director, I'll come back to that later, but the director was very, very well-known, world reputation director with Oscar nominations, etc., etc. And he had made this film 20 years ago, and the film had been screened on Channel 4 and everything. The script had been translated by one of the kind of top translators in the United States, and it had never been published. It had never been published in Russian and never been published in English. So he gave that to me as a gift on the occasion of an interview that I did with him for a different project. Second issue, we have documents, and what I have thought of there was to do a section where we publish archival materials in translation, correspondence, memoirs, something that could be of interest. We've been quite fortunate in that we've kind of stumbled into and been led to discover by various people on the editorial advisory boards. We've had 2 publications, I think, so far on Eisenstein. And you think, okay, Eisenstein's kind of, everything's been said about and written about and all the kind of things. Nothing new to discover. Wrong. We discovered Lars Kleberg, who is a colleague from Sweden, drew our attention to a publication that had occurred in the 1930s in some obscure socialist newspaper in the United States, of a lecture that Eisenstein had delivered during his stay in America. And this had not been included in the collected volume of Eisenstein's writing in Russian. The text only existed in a Russian typescript. The translation of that American publication was absolutely rotten. So we retrieved from the archive, from the Eisenstein collection, we retrieved the original typescript and had it retranslated by Richard Taylor, who is the Eisenstein scholar and who's also on the editorial board, and we were able to publish that. So you kind of, you sometimes find things that you never thought of, you think everything has been said about. Book reviews, I've already mentioned. I have decided from my journal that it is better to have the book reviews in one issue rather than have a little bit of a kind of a book review here and none in the second issue and then another one in the third issue, to collate them in one issue per year. It will work differently for all of you, I think. On these kind of, special things that we have tried to publish. I've already spoken about the script which we managed to publish in the first issue, which was of course very important because it was the launch issue. We've also included a script of a film that was screened in Rotterdam at the International Film Festival, so that we could kind of send the journal copies there, and in the hope of maybe finding 1 or 2 more subscribers. And issue 4.2, which is the one that is currently only in 1 copy of a proof on Sarah's desk, carries a cluster of articles on Central Asian cinema today, which we have done especially to serve as a discussion basis for a roundtable at the Open Doors in Locarno, where the journal will also be on sale and where we will present it during that roundtable discussion. The Open Doors is a pitching market. It's a specially designed program where the festival invites young directors from a selected region. It was China last year, Central Asia this year, to pitch their projects. They're pre-selected, and they would like to give those young filmmakers an opportunity to find co-producers in Europe. And you can imagine that for countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, this is particularly important. So, something else to say where I'm going to quote some of the people who are sitting in the back there. Intellect advises, your pharmacist tells you, don't do clusters or guest editing for the first 2 years. And I think this was, one of the most valuable pieces of advice that you've given me. First of all, you want to, in the first 2 years, create a profile for your journal. And I think you want to kind of put your own fingerprint on that, rather than hand over to somebody else. Once you have gained experience, and we'll come back to the experience in a moment, you can do that. You can hand over, but because you know what you want, you know what to expect, and you will probably also have a vague idea of what you want your guest editor to do and who you want your guest editor to be, because this is important. You may get on with somebody extremely well. You may be dealing with a very, very competent, intelligent, prolific writer. That's not always the best editor. The peer review process, if you do go for a cluster or for a guest edited journal, the peer review process is always one that you should conduct as editor, not your guest editor. You send out for the peer reviews, and you get the peer reviews back, and you liaise with the authors, and you give the authors feedback from the peer review process. This is very important because we must make sure that we have a consistency in standards. That I think is one of the things that is our responsibility, and we want to make sure that that is maintained. And you don't want to find yourself in a position where your guest editor approaches people for peer review who may not be the kind of who may not be aware of the standing of your journal. And I know this sounds in a sense very arrogant, but you, with bearing in mind that you rely on your contributions, your contributors rely on you to make sure that the standard of the journal is good. You owe that to them, because the better the standard of your journal and the standing and the reputation of your journal, the more it's going to count for the RAE. And I know this sounds awful, but that's life. I think it's very, very important. And I have in fact had peer reviews which said, this is a kind of, it's an okay article, it's kind of nowhere near what you want for a journal of the standing of SRSC. And in a sense, you feel almost proud when they say that, because it means that you have got a very high standard of that journal. And it means that the panels, whatever the panels are going to do, we don't know. We can only speculate about what's going to happen in the next ref. But we are aware of the way in which journals are ranked and rated, have been ranked and rated in the previous RAE. So I think we don't want to lose that momentum, because it's going to be more difficult to rebuild it than to maintain it. So when I'm dealing with clusters, and I've had 2 clusters so far, I always use one peer reviewer for all the articles, and one peer reviewer for the second peer reviewer, I give 1 article each, so that I have one peer reviewer who's kind of looking specifically at a particular topic, at a particular submission, and one peer reviewer who looks at those submissions overall. That's kind of piece of advice. You don't have to do that, but I find it very useful, because they look at the submissions from different perspectives. Does something fit in? Is something repetitive? Or are there any issues to do with the presentation of the cluster, which I think is also important. Peer review is probably the most important point in this whole business of being a journal editor. Let me give you a piece of advice that I don't always follow myself. Read the article first. You may find you've received a term paper. I have put that in because it is based on the experience of a very recent experience, in fact on a conversation I was talking about that only the other day. In this case, liaise with one of your co-editors or with one person from the editorial board and make a decision. You are not going to do yourself a favour, you're not going to discriminate, but you're not going to do yourself a favour by sending out something that is clearly nowhere near what you would expect in your journal to a second peer reviewer who will say, why are you sending me such rubbish? You're not going to do yourself a favour. You're wasting somebody's time. Save it for a more important issue. And let me tell you, I don't make that decision easily, and I never make it on my own. I always consult with somebody, and we always keep the anonymity of the contributor in question in the case of the consulting process. But it really is sometimes the case that you can decide this is not going to go anywhere. Your peer reviewers, they are extremely important. They are very, very generous. They are very often also late. Try to determine your peer reviewers by specialism. You will know best who knows who has written about a particular topic, who will be the ideal person to review a submission. Always ask first, and don't send them the article and say, peer review this for me. I always make a point of asking first, can you do this? I would like a report. Sometimes I would like a report very quickly, sometimes I have more time. So I always say, would it be possible for you to say, can you quickly review this for me, because I have a gap in the next issue and I could possibly fill it if this article would be suitable. So it's always helpful to sort of keep that kind of correspondence, that sort of personal correspondence with your peer reviewers. Don't overwork one and the same set of people on the editorial board. You will always have people who are extremely efficient, who are wonderful reviewers, who write excellent, long, detailed reports. That doesn't mean you should send them every second article. It's a huge danger. So keep a list of who you have asked when, and I'll come back to that kind of list keeping or scheduling in a moment. One thing also to bear in mind is anonymize your documents. Always make sure you go into the properties function in Word, that you anonymize the document and insert, say, intellect as the author, intellect as the institution or company or wherever the name of the person might appear in the properties. Does everybody understand what I'm doing? I thought so. Anonymize. And something else that I sometimes tend to forget is, do make sure that you go through the footnotes, because a lot of authors have a tendency of saying, as I have discussed in my article, and then give their name and their publication. So, or I would like to thank so and such, and you immediately think, aha, this is somebody from that university. And in my field, you usually have two people at a particular institution who are potential authors of a particular piece. So you're kind of giving it away there. So make sure that you check the footnotes. I usually set my review as a 6-week deadline. As I say, sometimes I ask for a quicker turnaround, if that is at all possible. I usually set a 6-week deadline, send out a reminder of the report being due in a week's time, a week before you want the report. In the summer months, I'm usually quite lax about, people go on holiday, and I kind of wait until week 8 before I ask for a report to come back. But you do have to remind people, because it's the sort of thing that they put in their tray to do next week or the week after or next month. They forget about it, and unless you remind them, it is genuinely very often a question of having forgotten. Sometimes they also lose the article that you have sent them. Sometimes their computer crashes. Sometimes they have contracted a computer virus. Be prepared for all of that. Evaluation. the most probably delicate part of your work. You receive contradictory reports. Reviewer 1 says, brilliant article. Reviewer 2 says, absolutely impossible, don't publish. What do you do? We've discussed this with various people at Intellect here, and I've also discussed this with other people who edit journals, with my co-editors. And it is ultimately the editor who makes the decision, so it's you. Sometimes when I feel that I'm competent enough to understand what the reviewers are talking about, when the article is on a subject that I'm familiar with and feel at ease with, and I feel that I can make that decision, I make it. If that's not the case, I ask for a third peer review. And I go with the decision of that third peer reviewer. That's, I think, it happens very rarely. Usually you get one peer review who says, this is kind of reject, and the other one who says serious revisions, in which case it's not a drama. I think that's, again, something you can decide. Or you get somebody who says this is absolutely brilliant, and the second person says slight revisions. So, you very rarely get kind of completely contradictory reports. But if you do, then if they are absolutely contradictory, then I involve a third peer reviewer. And I tell the author, don't forget that. Tell the author that there is a delay in the peer review process. Don't tell the author you're asking for a third peer review, but just say there is a delay in the review process. Apologies, I'll get back to you later. And that's also one of the cases where you contact somebody and say, can you do this in 4 weeks? Read the report carefully. Extract the important points, especially if a report is unwieldy. I tend to not send the reports as they come in to the contributors. I tend to do a letter. I have created a little kind of letterhead for myself, and I tend to say, first of all, thank you for the submission, blah, blah, blah. We've now had the reports, and they suggest either this or that, and sort of do a little bit of kind of sweet talking, especially if the reports are going to be critical, let's say. And in the response, I then highlight some of the positive features as well. Even if your article is going to be rejected, say this is very interesting, but unfortunately. So I know it's hard, but we do that with students anyway. We find something positive to say. And I also I don't want to sort of say this is the ultimate solution, but for me I think works better to put excerpts of the reviewers' reports into the letter, which doesn't mean that you are distorting the report, but sometimes one reviewer says the same thing as the other reviewer. Sometimes reviewers send you a long list of typos, which can be extremely kind of disheartening if they cover like 3 or 4 pages. And one of the things that I do, which is a lot of work for yourself, but in the long term it kind of helps you because the result that you get in the end is so much better. And we'll come back to formats of submissions in a moment, is to send a marked up file where I just kind of do, if these are minor corrections, just do the delete, the add, the insert yourself and send and this will come up as you have made these corrections, so you're not disclosing the identity of your peer reviewer. It's much easier than sending kind of 5 pages of insert a comma there, remove a full stop there, which kind of, when you see it, and especially when you have somebody who submitted, say, their first or second article, and they see this, kind of looks can look very disheartening. So I sometimes do a markup file along with the report instead of sending massive kind of toilet rolls of massive lists of correction. As I say, this is kind of a question, I think, of taste rather than anything else. I find that by sending the marked up copy, You can also insert various bits and pieces where you tell the author, actually, while you're doing these revisions, could you also make sure that you follow Intellect House style? Because let me tell you something else. 50% of your contributors are not going to follow Intellect House style. We have the guidelines online. We have the guidelines in the journal. This does not mean that your ordinary contributor will read those guidelines and will follow those guidelines. 50% of my submissions follow, for example, the footnote references instead of the Harvard-style references. So if you don't want to find yourself in a position when you are trying to put together the content and send it off to Intellect, if you don't want to be sitting there reformatting footnotes into Harvard style, say that in the marked up copy, say it in the letter before the author does revisions. I've just been talking yesterday, in fact, to a colleague who is for the first time editing an issue of a journal that has already been in existence for a long time, and who has precisely that problem, that all the submissions, the format is completely wrong. And when I say that, it sounds trivial. It takes you about 5 to 6 hours to reformat from footnote to Harvard, to get all the film titles in the right format, to check the references, because also your authors will not always give you the full references. The more of that you do at the stage of sending the author a marked up file or giving the feedback, the easier it will be for you when you come to putting the journal together, and the easier it will be for the copy editor, who will already not have to worry about things like that, but can focus on the important things, and the less work you will have to do once you get the files back from the copy editor. So you invest at a point where it actually makes a huge amount of sense, and you save yourself and everybody else an enormous amount of time for later. And let me tell you one thing, when you are in the process of submitting the journal, you usually find that you are in a rush. You have 500 other things to do as well. So, something else to bear in mind when you give authors feedback is you probably know who your authors are, not in the sense of the name, but whether they are people who are postgrads, who are mid-career, or who are emeritus professor. Encourage young authors. Even if you have a quite critical peer review, encourage them and say, look, we've kind of got these peer reviews and we can't publish it in the current form, but take a look at the peer reviews, see what you can use from that feedback. If you like to send an article in a different form, if you like to rework the article, we will look at it again. It will have to go through the peer review process again, but we are happy to have another look at it. So that's always one thing where you can encourage at the same time as saying, actually, no, we're not going to take this. So it's the kind of, it's the plus behind the minus, as it were. One thing I have also found is I thought I was good at this, to say, tell your authors when they hear back. Especially younger authors are terribly, terribly nervous. And even when you tell them, I will be getting back to you within 6 to 8 weeks, they will say, oh, brilliant, fantastic. we've kind of been waiting for months and months and months after submissions to other scholarly journals. And then, come week 7, and you can you sometimes already get a message, you sure we can get the report next week? So bear that in mind. They are really, really very, very, they can be very nervous. I think one of the good indicators would be for a journal to have a quick feedback. I know from my own experience that American journals, the kind of top scholarly journals in my field, they very often have a process where the peer review takes between 6 to 9 months. I have recently been working on a cluster which I have been editing for an American journal, and we have submitted the cluster, let me think, 2 years ago. We waited a year for the first set of peer reviews. I don't think that's a very happy scenario. So I don't know whether that's supposed to add to the prestige of a journal. I don't think it does. Something else is that the feedback that you give to authors, make it detailed. And this sort of marked up copy is one thing that helps in that process, to give them a sense that somebody has really closely looked at this submission. I think from the responses of authors that I have had, there have been a number of cases where an author has said, "Thank you so much for the letter and for the feedback, even if the article had been rejected. I have never had such detailed feedback from a journal." So, it's positive, especially if you're going to reject something. Give good feedback. It's not as though you're kind of rubbing in an already existing wound, but make it, and that's why I say I think the framing here is very important, to say that this is very disappointing, but maybe the following feedback will help you put this submission on the right track, and then give that detailed feedback. But as I say, authors generally value quick feedback and detailed feedback. I know it's kind of very demanding, but here we are. One of the consolation prizes you can always give away in your correspondence with authors is, and your journal has a very high rejection rate, so I shouldn't be too disappointed. In fact, I was looking at the rejection rate. You know that this is also a kind of factor that is taken into account in the ranking of journals. And of course we don't do it on purpose, but I was looking at the rejection rate on SRSC. I think we're 50%, which I think is quite high. Illustrations. Masoud has already been talking about intellect being devoted to visuals, to creative, and paying a lot of attention to the design issue. And I think illustrations are not only hugely important, especially for film journals, for journals that deal with performing arts as well, but they can be problematic in that they are not problematic for intellect. But you want to make sure that you tell authors that you can have illustrations, because they are a vital part of the publication. And the sooner you tell the author what exactly it is that you want, the better quality image you get. First of all, let me say it is acceptable to grab frames from a DVD. It's perfectly all right in terms of copyright, but the quality can be an issue, and you have to do, either you as editor, in my case I do this, or you have to get your authors to doctor the images, because you can actually reset the resolution and you can trim them and crop them and do whatever you like, and make them suitable for publication. Make sure that you think about that before you submit content to Intellect. One piece of advice is that for region-based journals, film centres are more than often willing to help you with stills. On a different front, on the front of Kinokultura, when we have done our special issues, we have usually been extremely lucky in working with film centres, film institutes, say with the Croatian Film Institute, with the Estonian Film Academy, etc., who have been, with the Czech Film Institute for that matter, who have just sent us entire DVDs with files of images and said, take what you want. So they can be extremely helpful. Bear that in mind, especially if you have a region-based journal. Also, when I talked about images that are not a problem for Intellect, they are not a problem in production. And what I think is absolutely wonderful is that you can turn around and you can say, Masoud has already mentioned I do a lot of colour illustrations. They are not a problem. You can turn around and say, actually, can we have these images in colour? And I've just had one case where an author has been comparing film stills with paintings. And of course, try and reproduce a painting in black and white. It's not going to look nice. So we had the the painting, the artwork, in colour, and the still from the film in black and white, and I think that works beautifully. So you can actually kind of be very creative on that front, and there is huge technical support and other support for that sort of exercise. Images, also think about images already at the stage of when you invite the article to be resubmitted, reformatted. When you accept an article, tell the author to think about illustrations and to mark in the text file that the author is going to submit where the image should be located, and to put in a caption. It helps sometimes. It's especially funny when you mix up the captions. I've just given you the example of the artwork and the stills from the film. Well, I had the captions the wrong way round. I sent out the proofs to the author. The author said, beautiful, wonderful. And it was only on the second proof where I suddenly thought, no, this is not quite right. But that's not the highlight. I can give you one highlight where this was not intellect. I can assure you, where I think I'd written a book, and it was on Mikhalkov's Burnt by the Sun, and we had a caption which read, "Here is Kotov with his happy family," and the image that was supposed to go there was Mikhalkov playing Kotov with his wife and his daughter. Caption perfectly all right. Here come the proofs. And what does the image show? 3 drunken men in front of a Russian hut. And I thought, and it was from a different film. So how that image got into that particular publication, you know, I can only invent various legends about that. But you know, what was the editor thinking? Putting an image with 4 men into the Kotov and his happy family. Okay, so problems. The problems, as you can probably gather from my rather long expose of working with intellect at different stages. No problems on the production, on the scheduling, etc. front. Problems concern issues such as translation. You occasionally will get a submission in a foreign language which either needs to be translated or heavily edited, and you practically have to draw on the kindness of editors to get that done. The translation, of course, of the film scripts is something that I do myself. So, and that's a question of timing very often. Submission. So think about the translation issue. Translations of in my case, it concerns particularly those sections that I've invented myself. So I've only got myself to blame, as it were. Translation of documents and translation of the film scripts. My problem in my particular case is also submissions from Russia, which are where the standards you want to have international submissions. We all want that, but standards of research rarely allow publications. There are a lot of submissions where the article is written in a completely different style, in a very kind of journalese, as it were, inadequate use of sources, inadequate referencing, etc., etc. And there is a huge problem, I think, in the training of film historians and film scholars in Russia and post-Soviet countries, where the students, scholars, researchers don't read any foreign languages. And just to give you one example, we have, Kindness of Intellect, been placing copies in the Film Institute in Moscow, which is the main training center for directors, filmmakers, and film critics, and film scholars, film historians. And what do you think has happened? They have put the journal in the kind of back room in the storage section of the library, and you know, I've spoken. I talk to the students at the Film Institute because I think, you know, we want to bring that new generation, and in particular of Russian scholars, into publishing. And they didn't even know that it was there, and the majority of students also don't speak English. So we have a situation where the Russian film scholars who we would like to get to kind of contribute to a journal of that specialism, we have problems with that, because if they don't read English language publications, they very often repeat things that have already been argued 10, 15 years ago in English scholarship, English and American scholarship. So it's kind of very problematic, but that's not an issue that any one of us or intellect can solve, I think. But just something to bear in mind, how you deal with submissions, and because I find it very difficult to sort of apply the same standards and the same measurements to submissions from those countries. It's just something to think about. I think I've covered the last point on that as well. Prizes. I know that Susan is much better on this. She has, her journal has been running for 10 years. SRSC, I've been wanting to do this for quite some time, and I think next year is the time when we can actually do this. It's the journal's 5th year, and I want to offer a prize for the best postgraduate submission. It's always a good thing to think about that. I've been thinking about it far too long and not doing enough, but it's a way of finding an incentive to encourage publications from young scholars, and I think that's something we all want. Conferences and seminars. They are extremely useful to promote the journal, but also to encourage submissions, to organize a conference in particular. And you can sometimes, by organizing a workshop or a symposium rather than a major international 10-day conference, you can already get a themed issue together. So it's something also to think about. In fact, my experience of doing that sort of thing goes back before I came to the time before I came to Intellect, and it gave a kind of different result. I organized a conference on the Russian national identity in contemporary cinema back in the late 1990s, and that led to a publication of a volume. It's just something to think about. Shopping is one of the most exciting things in the profession of being an editor. Go to conferences, attend as many panels as you can, attend as many conferences as you can, especially in the first couple of years. Because both my experience as section editor of MLR, and this was an extremely useful experience that I learned there and brought to SRSC, is that kind of way of going to conferences, going to the panels where you think you are going to find interesting papers, approaching people and saying, I'm launching a new journal, will you please submit your paper once you have turned it into an article? And it has helped tremendously. I have had probably sort of between 30 and 40% of submissions as a result of personally, or after the conference, if I can't go to the panel, approaching people by email and saying, I have seen this, I'm sorry, I was giving a paper at the same time, or I was at another panel at the same time, even if you were having coffee or you were still suffering from jet lag, and say, I'd be very interested, and would you like to submit it to the journal? It's a very, very good way of getting new authors to contribute to a journal, and shopping is one of my favorite bits of the editorial experience. Also ask your co-editors and editorial board to do similar things. To when they hear a good paper, to approach the paper giver and tell them to submit. Go to sessions with potentially interesting topics that might also give you ideas, and I think this is really, really important, especially when you first launch the journal. One thing I haven't mentioned is this sort of balance that you can afford to think about it when you have more submissions than you need for one particular issue. So in a sense, I'm talking green language here, but one thing you want to bear in mind is when you put together a particular issue is how many contributions do you have of recognized scholars in proportion to young scholars? It is always a good idea to have one article in your journal by somebody whose name people will recognize when they open the journal. Then you can afford to have young scholars. If you have a journal issue only with, say, between postgraduates and first publications, especially after you launch the journal, I would probably see whether you can get somebody established to tie in, and not to a journal issue where you just have first publications. It's not to say that they are bad, but your readers and library subscriptions will open the journal and will think, oh, well, I don't know anyone in here, and put it aside. I know but this happens. I can give you another example of where I've made exactly that mistake, although it wasn't exactly my fault. My last issue of Kinokultura has reviews of a range of films that nobody has heard of. Now, that's not my fault, but it is a problem. I don't make the films, so I can only review the films that have been produced by film directors out in Russia. But it's a problem. And I can see the problem, and my readers can see the problem. And I've already spoken with somebody who said, I can see what you mean. This is a really kind of weird issue, isn't it? So, it's something to bear in mind. Whether you want it or not, people say it. Article submissions can be very uneven. Have a plan how to bridge the gap if you don't have enough submissions. I.e. think of clusters, special features. We once had a special feature to mark the centenary of Russian cinema. The Soviet history is full of all these kind of anniversaries. They sometimes give you a wonderful way out if you have a gap. Intellect are flexible on the size of each issue. So if you have one issue with only 3 articles, you can have the next one with 5 or 6, so that's fine as long as you have a kind of an overall content in the volume. And these sort of reserve articles, as I say, I was talking dream language here. I have found that especially in the first 2 years, you are unlikely to have a bank of articles. I would love to have one. It's an extremely good idea where you have you have a store of articles already ready for the next issue. So one thing that I do want to share, just to sort of conclude, is do a plan. I have a table which is very, very boring. Author title, the date when I've received a submission, review 1 by Taylor has been sent out on the 5th of July, review to Smith has been sent out on the 6th of July, so that you know who is reviewing which article and when to remind them, when they have been sent the file. Decision, I've kind of put here, I've written to the author, rejected, revision, accepted for a particular issue, and when I have written to the author. It's also, I sometimes also mark here whether the reviewer has said yes or no or revise, so that you see where you might be going and how many articles you are likely to have for the next issue. So I keep a table like that so that I'm that I know what I've done, basically. I find this invaluable because sometimes you go away, you come back, you can't remember, have I sent this, have I not sent this for peer review, when did I tell the peer reviewer to get back to me, has he had enough time, that sort of thing. It's very, very useful to have a table like that, so I recommend that.